Hi guys, Sam from Everything PSP here. Today we're doing something a bit different, and maybe I should say Everything PS3, because in this episode we are going to be dismantling and refurbishing a PlayStation 3 that I was given. So we're just going to start the video by going through what was in the bag that I was given. There's a couple of controllers here, the original instruction manuals, also some SingStar microphones, which was a nice bonus, but we'll leave those aside for the time being. You can see here just how disgusting and filthy these controllers are with all the human slime on them. And there's a few extra cables, the charging cables and the power supply cable. Now here's the console itself, and upon immediate inspection it is absolutely covered in dust. So before we do anything else, we'll give the exterior a good clean and then we'll start to dismantle it. And you can already see, if I rub my finger across the surface, just how much dust is flaking up into the air. Looking at the air vent on the side, it is completely blocked with grit and dust and dirt, so it's no wonder that the console wasn't running properly. I'd say this is most likely an overheating issue, or it started as an overheating issue and has now progressed into something worse. Here's the model information for anyone who's interested, and a quick overview of the console before we start pulling it apart. Now the best thing to do is to give it a good clean, because we are going to be spending so much time around this console, and we also want to make sure that while we're refurbishing it we don't push any dirt or dust further deeper into the console. So it's better to clean as much as possible at each stage of the disassembly as we go along, and then we'll go right down to the bare bones. We'll strip everything back, do a massive deep clean, and then slowly begin to reassemble all the components and fix anything along the way if we need to. So now that we've cleaned the exterior, the next thing we're going to do is remove the warranty sticker. Now this console is really old, so obviously there's no chance of any warranty being voided because it's already outdated, but you can just peel that sticker back, and then there's a rubber stopper underneath which needs to be removed in order to access the security screw. Now, I used the T10 Torx bit to undo this. It is technically a security bit, but if you have a steady hand you can use a standard Torx bit to remove it. Okay, with that taken care of, the next step is to remove the front faceplate. You do this just by sliding it. Firstly, you slide it that way, like so, and then you slide it up like that, and then it comes away. It's actually slightly transparent, which is quite cool. I wasn't aware of that. And now we're just going to give it another good clean on that face. You can see a bit of dirt there. Now we need to unscrew where I'm pointing here using a Phillips head. There are, I think, 6 long screws and 1 short screw. The short screw is marked with an S on the plastic, so you can't miss it. Now this was my first warning sign when I got some dust on the threads of that screw. I could tell that by going further into this console we were about to find a whole heap of crap to clean up. Now there's your long screws plus 1 short screw. Okay, so with those screws removed, there's now a metal tab which you need to depress in order to release the top, and you kind of have to do it in one motion, like so, and the whole thing hinges forward. There's tabs along the front, so be careful when you do this step, but so long as you're slow it should pry itself loose. And we can see a little bit of dust collected on the inside of that lid, and here with the air vent that we saw from the outside. Now from the interior you can see just how badly clogged up that is, and look at this. This is absolutely disgusting. You know, I've fixed a few things in my time, but this really took the cake in terms of just the sheer amount of dust. I mean, I knew it was going to be bad and a little bit dirty, but I wasn't expecting to see this much filth just caked on absolutely everything. So this is going to be a big part of the job, is to clear all of this up in a safe way to try and restore the console, even to the point where some of the hardware was actually completely covered by all this dust. I had to go fishing for that screw there. But our next step in the disassembly is to remove the power supply screws. Before we do that, however, I think it's probably wise to put on some gloves just to stop our hands getting unnecessarily dirty and to make the process just a little bit nicer. You can see all that dust just from that one area there. I'm trying to collect it into a bowl so it doesn't go flying around the workshop. And we've already encountered our first hurdle. This screw on the back of the power supply is completely seized on there from all of the rust that's developed over the years. What you'll find happens is that any dust that's sitting on the console attracts moisture, and that begins to corrode the surface that it's on. And I tried a few different tools hoping that the screw would give. So after failing with the multi-tool, I tried a standard screwdriver to no avail. Then from there processed onto machine oil to try and lubricate the threads. Coming back with the screwdriver, still no luck. Moving to a hand drill now, and quickly decided that it's time to bring out the big guns. So we are going to be drilling this out. I tried my vice grips and my needle nose pliers, but they were just too big. So the next step is to choose a bit that's going to suit the size of the head of the screw and get stuck in. Now just starting by going in the reverse direction to center it and applying the speed slowly. The last thing I wanted to do was to drill a hole right through to the bottom of the PlayStation, so I was very careful, applying gentle force and working my way around the head of the screw, just trying to break it free from the threads so that we can remove the power supply. And after a couple of minutes of that, we were able to destroy it, and using a automotive magnet tool that I just had lying around, used that to clean up all the metal filings and stop them from getting further into the case or falling on the board and contaminating something, causing corrosion or also potentially a short circuit. So it's really important to clean that up as you go before removing the power supply. But now we can see that it's free, so the next step is back on the bench and to start removing the plugs. So you've got this white plug on the back with a little tab you need to squeeze in, and then on the front as well there's another cable that we will address. But before we do that, I decided that it was wise to spend some more time just clearing off some more of that surface dust before we start unplugging and removing everything. The last thing I want is for dust to get stuck into one of the connectors, so it's better to clean the area around the connector before removing it. And here you can see the front cable for the power supply is now loose. There's all the dust we've collected so far. Now I'm using a lot of movie magic to speed this video up, but in reality I broke this project up over a few nights, probably spent about 4 or 5 hours in total, and just took my time through each step of the process, did a lot of research in between. But you can see there, that's about the amount of dust we've collected in the bowl so far. Now we can gently remove the power supply and take a look inside. There is a lot of dirt and grime in the power supply, so I'm dubious about its health, but we're just going to continue to clean the surface that it has now exposed. In its absence, I can also go in and take a few more metal filings with the magnet and get rid of those, make sure they're not going to interfere with anything when we put it back together. Now the next step is to borrow the wife's hairdryer and just put it on a cold setting and blow out as much of the crap as we could. There is still some stuff that's really deep in there, and it's hard to tell, but it looks like one of the capacitors may be busted. At this point of the project, it made sense to give it a good deep clean, just in case we can bring it back to life. So that's the power supply all done. The next step is to remove the Blu-ray drive, which we're going to do by disassembling the power supply cable there, and then the ribbon connector. Again, giving it a bit of a de-dust, a bit of a clean up before we pull the tab, so as to not introduce any dust into the actual connector or onto the pins themselves. So now we have the drive out of the console. We're going to give this a quick clean. So removing the main area of dust did reveal some rust spots on the face of the drive, but it seems that the rest of the drive is pretty much intact, so we're just cleaning everything up. Being particularly careful of the ribbon cable because it's very delicate, and also of the face of the drive where the discs are inserted, because we don't want to inject too much solvent into the interior of the drive. And that is the Blu-ray drive all complete. So the next step is to remove the hard drive. This is a 2.5 inch SATA bay, and there is a cover which can be pried off like so, revealing a blue coloured screw which can then be removed. And once you remove that screw, there's a little handle that you can pull on, and that will then pull the hard drive off the motherboard. So we're now going to slide out the hard drive on its tray, and this is an original 40 gig hard drive that came with the PS3. I will be upgrading this to a solid state drive in the future, but for now we're going to remove these screws which hold the upper bracket. So this component's not in too bad of a condition, but there is some dust and crap on there, so we'll give that a good clean as well. Again, our trusty isopropyl, just working in all the grooves, making sure we get as much grime as we can, paying attention to the holes on the shield. And for the hard drive, I do not recommend using any solvents to clean it. This is a big no-no. Just use a fresh paper towel and give it a gentle dusting. Hard drives are designed to be airtight and are very resilient, so I wouldn't worry too much. Just give the outside a bit of a clean and try and get some dust out of the connector area. Otherwise, if the hard drive's buggered, you pretty much have to throw it away and replace it anyway, so there's no point in using solvents to clean it further. Now we can continue by removing this screw and then disconnecting the power supply to the motherboard and just tucking those to the side for now. So you should have the earth strap and the two power supply cables free. The next step is to remove this antenna. I'm not sure if it's Wi-Fi or Bluetooth, someone can tell me in the comments, but basically this is removed from the front control board, and then there's two screws that need to be broken off the back. There's a small piece of tape that holds the whole thing down, which we will replace when we reassemble it. Now this screw here was very stubborn, and I found that by going across to the other one and giving it some brute force, I managed to shock the other one loose as well. I was very grateful for this because I didn't want to have to get the power drill out again. So luckily I don't think we're going to be seeing that power drill again in this video. And the next step is to remove all of these screws to dismantle the upper shields. I just thought it would be worth mentioning, and it's something that I usually do, but in this case I did not, but you should really have a container or some way to organize the screws that you remove so that when you go to put them back you know where they are. That may be some low-key foreshadowing there, but we've got the shield off now, which protects the front control board or the front I/O, and we're now going to gently remove this ribbon cable so that we can take the board out. So I think this is a USB controller, maybe Bluetooth module as well. There's some large USB ports hanging off the bottom, so we'll put that aside for now. And now we're going to unscrew these spring metal clamps. This adds pressure to the top of the board, which in turn compresses the GPU and the CPU onto the heat sinks. So these are very important components. We must be delicate with them, keep them aside as they are. And now we're going to continue by removing this tiny screw at the front, cleaning up the other side of this cable. I decided to remove the ribbon cable entirely. You can leave it on there, but it's just easier instead of having to worry about trying to untuck that thing. So here is the upper dust cover, or the upper motherboard shield. I think this acts as an anti-static and a grounding surface as well. Now before we get into the motherboard, we're just going to quickly clean the components that we've already removed. So that little shield here has some really bad rust on it, but I figure for what it's actually functioning as, that won't make a difference. This USB controller is not too bad, but we're just going to give the copper traces a little bit of a cleanup. And then moving on to the upper shield. paying special attention to any areas that are going to come into contact with components and give that a nice clean up. The next thing is to pry out the motherboard very gently. The old thermal paste is holding it in there. There's no screws or anything holding it down at this point, it's just the thermal paste. And with that satisfying pop, we have now freed the motherboard, along with a whole flurry of dust onto the camera lens. So if you pry it up on an angle towards yourself, you can remove it, and now we can take a really close look at the actual motherboard itself. It's not too bad considering. We're definitely going to redo the thermal paste, and there's quite a few areas of dust that we will also address. Now this is the lower motherboard shield that it rests on. We're also going to remove that for cleaning, and you can see there the 2 points in which the heat sinks protrude through to contact with the chips on the motherboard. I'm going to start by unscrewing these parts here, and then we can remove the rear I/O shield, which also contains the power supply input. That all comes away as one piece and just slides out. I just wanted to briefly discuss how I found this procedure versus my usual PSP work, and in some ways it was easier because the components are larger, but in other ways it was trickier, being an unknown system for me to work on, and also the age and unknown condition of it was quite a challenge, which I did enjoy, but I'd quite like to have a go at some other consoles on the channel too. So now we've removed the fan, all as one piece, it stays in its shroud, there's no sense in dismantling that any further, and then these two heat sinks can be removed. And for some reason I'm really mesmerized by heat sinks. I really like the way the fins all look, and it's very important because they are quite delicate to be really careful with these things. So we've got 1 and 2, and now we're pretty much left with the very sad looking lower half of the console. Now we've got a much better look at all of the dirt and debris that has collected on the air intakes, and just a quick overview of all of the cleaning that I have ahead of me. So all of the components, the front, the lower shields, the heat sinks, the fan, the motherboard shield, the rear I/O, the motherboard itself, the top shield, the controller port, and the drive and the power supply, all laid out in front of us. And now we're going to begin the deep clean cycle. So this was probably the most laborious part of the whole build, but it was quite satisfying seeing the results after each step, especially when I was able to see daylight through these air intake holes. It was a really satisfying moment, and I felt like I'd actually achieved something. Now moving on to the lower half, basically the same thing, just cleaning everything as we go, trying to get rid of most of the dirt that we can. Just bearing in mind this isn't a 100% factory finish original cleaning. I'm just trying to get 90 or 98% of the dust that's in the system to prevent any future damage, or to be able to give the console the best chance it has at restarting. So that's pretty much as good as that's going to get. I think I did do another little bit of extra cleaning off camera, but basically, so long as it's functional, we're going to move on. Now the next step is the fan. It wasn't too bad, so I gave it a quick dusting and just hit the fans a little bit with a bit of cleaner. Bit of a foot reveal there. Bonus points if you can give me the timestamp for the foot reveal, I'll send you something nice. And yeah, so the fan's all clean. Now the next step is to do the rear I/O shield. So we're using a cotton tip for this because it's a bit fiddly with the vents, trying to get into all the nooks and crannies. Making sure that it's presentable. And you can see the difference there is night and day compared to what we started with. Now we're getting on to the motherboard shield itself, or one of the motherboard shields, this one being the lower of the two. And that's looking really nice and clean now. You can see just how much dirt has come off once we're done. The next step is to clean up the heat sinks. It is extremely important to make sure that these surfaces are mirror shined. It is completely free of any contaminants, because this is mating directly with the CPU and the GPU of the console. And I got quite mesmerized here for a minute just looking at all the reflections bounce off this component. The next step is to clean the motherboard itself. paying special attention to cleaning the thermal paste off the CPU and the GPU, and also addressing any dust or any obvious areas that need attention. In all fairness, this is actually not as bad as I thought it might be, so I was very pleased that after giving it a little bit of a clean with some ISO on a cotton pad, it really did actually clean up quite well. I found a good trick is to pick the component up and use the refraction of a light to identify any spots you may have missed in terms of grease or grime. But it's all looking pretty good, so the next thing we're going to do is to remove any surface dust. And then we're going to address the thermal paste. Now we have a clean, shiny, new-ish motherboard, and the surfaces of the CPU and GPU are nice and clean, ready for reapplying the thermal paste. If you're attempting to follow along and do any of this yourself, please be extremely careful. I'm not a professional by any means, I'm just a hobbyist, but I do my best to do things correctly. We're just replacing the CMOS battery here, or the BIOS battery. This is allowing the console to retain its internal clock or its internal settings when the power is off. It's just a CR2032, very common battery. Now we can begin reassembling the console. It's basically just a reverse order of what we've done. We're going to start by reinserting the heat sinks into their respective positions and gently lowering the fan assembly on top, as well as the rear I/O shield. And then screwing those down with the appropriate hardware. Again, I recommend using a container so you don't get the screws mixed up. Next to go in is the lower motherboard shield. And it is at this point where we are ready to apply thermal paste. Now please, again, do your research. I don't really know what I'm doing, to be fair. This was my first time applying thermal paste, at least at this scale. And so basically what I did was I applied a pea-sized drop to both the CPU and the GPU, and then I used the nozzle of the thermal paste container or the syringe to sort of smear around. I wasn't too happy with the result, so I then got a cotton bud, again probably a no-no, to further smear around and to remove off some of the excess. I understand it's better to use a spudger or just to use a pea-size method where you just apply a pea and leave it as it is, but that's what I've done, so let's see if it works. The next thing we're going to do is to slot the motherboard in at a 45-degree angle and make sure that it's really zeroed home in terms of being in line with its screws before we press it down to make contact with that paste. You kind of want to make sure that once it touches once, it sits there, and not to smear it around and rock it back and forth. That's where you can have problems. Now that I'm confident that the motherboard is sitting where it should, we're going to insert the upper shield, tucking that over the two prongs which will fit into the power supply, and making sure that that is sitting nicely on top. The next thing to do is to grab the spring steel clamps, which will then apply pressure through the motherboard to make contact with the GPU and the heatsink and spread that thermal paste out evenly, hopefully without too much overspill. It's highly recommended that you tighten these down in series, like a torque sequence, so go back and forth bit by bit until these screws are completely home. Now once those are done, we can move on to the earth strap of the power supply and tighten that one down. And now reconnect the motherboard power supply to the rear I/O power input socket, and really making sure that that connector is placed in there nicely, and again that make sure the connectors are free of contaminants. The next thing we did was just go around and install all the screws for the edge and put in that ribbon cable which connects to the controller, or the USB controller, or the USB controller for the USB controller. The USB controller. Anyway, so that's been installed now, and we're just going to tidy up the ribbon cables a little bit. I noticed some extra dirt that was bothering me, so just got rid of that, and now we can place the shield on top and screw that down as well. I'll probably have a little bit less to say as I put it back together because it is really just a reverse order from what we did before, but the next thing is this antenna, which I'm gonna say is Wi-Fi. And now we're applying some electrical tape over the factory paper tape. And with that completed, we are now going to screw down the board that controls the antenna. As well as tighten up the outer screws which hold the upper motherboard shield together. And this is the foreshadowing moment where I lost a screw. I wasn't able to retrieve it either, so there is still a screw missing from this console, but luckily it is not of overly structural importance, and I was able to continue the build without it, but it does still keep me up at night. So again, put your screws in a container, makes life a lot easier. Now when we slide the hard drive in, you want to make sure that it's all the way seated home to the connector on the motherboard, and then use that blue screw to tighten that home. The next thing we're going to install is the Blu-ray drive. Being very careful to line up the pins of the ribbon cable, while also being quite delicate. You don't want to force it in there because you could break it, and if you break the connector, you pretty much have to throw the whole motherboard away. There's also this connector which I believe is the read-write connector onto the board itself, and it may well supply power to it as well. Going to now lower the power supply onto the prongs that stick out of the motherboard, making sure that we're not putting any lateral force onto that, just lowering it down vertically, nice and gentle. Also making sure not to snag the cables, and then inserting the plug into the back and getting everything tucked away so it doesn't get stuck on the lid when we put the top back on. Also connecting the front connector of the power supply and then screwing it down. Next we're going to put the trim piece over the hard drive bay cover, which just clicks in like so. Next we're going to be reinstalling the lid. There's teeth on the front where you have to line them up and then gently rock it down, and then it will click at the back. That piece that we had to put pressure on to disconnect at the start, when you put the lid back on it will click into place. And we're just putting the screws back in, again in a sort of star torque setting. This may not be necessary, might just be a hangover from my automotive days, but I find it does help to give the console a really nice, well built feel, keep everything nice and rigid. And then we're putting the small screw in the back there as well. Finally putting the faceplate on and sliding it into position. And now we're pretty much on the home stretch. All of the tricky stuff is done. The next thing is to turn it around and put in the security screw. As well as the little rubber stopper. And then the next thing after that, once the rubber stopper's in, is to just do your best to make sure that that sticker, the warranty sticker, has been put back in place. Now I'm probably going to be using this console in the upright position, so that doesn't matter too much for me. If you're really worried, you could use a little bit of glue or contact adhesive. We're just going to give it another wipe down now that it's been apart and put back together, just to really finish off the console. And now I can show you just how it looks after all of our hard work. Now remember, we haven't actually turned this console on at all since receiving it, so it's a little bit of an unknown as to whether it's going to work. And any dust you see in the vents in these shots here are just very minor surface dust on the vents. When you look at it from a straight on angle, it is very clear and free of obstruction. So now that phase 1 is complete, it's on to phase 2, which is testing. First thing we can do is identify that it has a red light, so we know that it can turn on, which fingers crossed it will. Okay, so we get the startup screen. That's a really good sign. The next step is to get a controller connected and make sure that that is functional, which it is, another tick. Okay, so now we have a controller that's working wirelessly on the console, which is booted up, and no surprise, the console was not shut down properly the last time it was used, which was probably 10 years ago. Attempting a system restore, and it did boot into the home screen, so I was able to use the XMB to some extent and see what the previous owner had installed on here. So at this point everything's looking all good, and we have a working PS3 that we got for free. All it took was a few hours of hard work, and now we have a PS3 to enjoy. So the next thing is to try and load a Blu-ray disc. But someone put the wrong game in the wrong box, so a bit of movie magic, and we're going to try installing Far Cry 4. This will also give me a good idea if there's any dead spots or if there's any errors with the sectors on the hard drive, because this is a game that has to install its content onto the HDD to play. And this is where my biggest fears were realised. While I was off making a cup of tea, the console turned itself off. I had a quick feel for any hotspots and decided screw it, I'll turn it back on and see what happens. I got about another 5 or 10 minutes of operation this time, but it wasn't soon before long that I encountered the same error. Now this was the exact same symptom that the person who donated the console to me said it had all those years ago. So despite our efforts, we still haven't actually fixed the problem. All we've done is prevent any future problems. I decided to move the console into the bedroom anyway because I was getting tired of working in the cold garage, and I figured it would be nicer to mess around with it from this point onwards now that I'd given it a good clean. So the first thing we can do to eliminate some of the variables is to change the power supply cable out for a new one. Now sometimes power supply cables can be an issue, so I popped down to JCar Electronics down the road and picked this cable up for about $8. Now even worse, with this new cable, the console doesn't even turn on. I left it for about a day and then tried again, and luckily I was finally greeted with the splash screen, but after about 5 seconds of operation it shut itself down. The weather began to reflect my mood as I looked back on all the hours I'd wasted, but finally around Christmas time the power supply unit was delivered to me from somebody in my local gaming page. So while I disassemble this console, I'll just talk through my thought process here. While I was aware of the red and yellow lights of death that PS3s are often afflicted with, the fact that we've already done a major teardown and replaced all of the thermal paste pretty much eliminated that variable for me. The only thing that was left was the power supply unit, and I did remember that when we started, that was probably the component that was most affected by the dirt and the grime and neglect. So the first place I went looking for answers was on Reddit, and that was probably my first mistake, because most of the people I spoke to said it was a done deal, and I might as well throw the whole console away. Undeterred by this, I spoke to some local enthusiasts who did have a power supply that would suit my model, and I decided to go ahead and purchase one from them. This guy actually ended up donating me the power supply for the cost of shipping alone after hearing my tale of woe. So that reinvigorated my passion for this project, and I continued on in earnest. Now you can see here, going back to the video, that I have replaced the power supply with the new unit, and we're going to now put all the screws back in and plug it in as we did before, and fingers crossed when we test it it's actually going to work. Now the reason I'm sure it's the power supply is because normally if there's a fault with the motherboard or another component, the PS3 is smart enough to tell you via a series of flashes and beeps on the front I/O. The fact that I had no display whatsoever and it was cutting completely cold to power off made me assume that the power supply was at fault from the get-go. Now that we've put Vader's mask back on, we're going to plug him in and see what happens. But before we do so, I just wanted to quickly show you guys some PS3 games that I purchased for myself, being overzealous and expecting this to all go swimmingly. But surprise surprise, it actually worked. So now that Far Cry 4 has finally booted up 2 months later, we're going to install the top screws on the PS3 for the last time, thankfully. And then once those are done, we're going to slide on the front faceplate. And finally, after one cut finger, a lot of swearing, a few restless nights, and a couple of phone calls, I've finally managed to build my own PS3 or at least refurbish a PS3 from scratch, thanks to some kind donations from a couple of viewers and some people in local community pages. Now this PS3 has actually been put to good use. Not only have we updated it to the latest firmware and played a whole bunch of games, reliving some childhood memories, which has been really fun, but we've also managed to use it for Spotify, Netflix, as well as YouTube, and we are also using it as a media server where it's connected to our local PC for streaming movies and watching other kinds of content. So it's actually gotten a lot of use, and I've been really enjoying getting to know the PS3 and using remote play with the PSP as well. There's just so many features I can't cover them in this video, but I was really pleasantly surprised with this project and I had a lot of fun doing it. Just quickly, as a before and after, you can see the disgusting mess that we started with, and the final result, a beautiful, working, fat PS3, and I've got to say by comparison, this made PSPs seem like a piece of cake. A big thank you to those who've made it this far in the video. Please like, comment and subscribe to stay notified of future releases. I've been your host Sam, and I'll see you next time on Everything PSP.